He had always followed every command. But now, there was one order he wouldn't obey. In a quiet, dimly lit room on the outskirts of town, Sergeant James Henderson stood facing his K9 Max. The German shepherd, with his deep amber eyes and sleek, sable coat, had been his partner in everything. Through thick and thin, from treacherous mountain rescues to nerve-wracking bomb searches, Max had always been by his side, never once faltering. But today was different. Today, something was different. "Max, heel," James commanded, his voice firm, as it had always been. Max didn't move. For a split second, James thought it was a joke. Maybe Max was just distracted, tired, or maybe he hadn't heard. But then he saw it. Max's gaze, once filled with unwavering loyalty, now seemed distant, as if the bond they shared was suddenly strained. He repeated the command, louder this time. "Max, heel." But the dog only looked up at him, his ears slightly tilted, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just any dog. This was Max, the dog who had saved his life more times than James could count. The dog who had refused to leave his side, even in the darkest of moments. They had been through wars together, both literally and metaphorically. James's mind raced. What could have caused this sudden shift? What could possibly break the unbreakable bond between them? Was Max injured? Was he scared? No, James thought. He knew Max well enough to know when something was wrong. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't injury. It was something deeper. Something was wrong with their connection. Max, who had always obeyed every order without hesitation, was refusing now. As James stood there, the weight of the silence settled around them. The dog's refusal wasn't just a disobedience. It felt like a rejection. It was as if Max was telling him, in the only way he knew how, that something was no longer right. He took a step back, breathing in the air, his hands shaking slightly. He thought about the days they had spent together. The moments of quiet understanding when no words were needed, when Max had known exactly what he was thinking, when they had been more than just man and dog. They had been a team. But now, in this small room, that team felt fractured. James crouched down, his voice softer, almost pleading. "Max, what's wrong?" Max's eyes met his. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet, unspoken understanding. It was as if the dog had decided that he couldn't follow that command anymore, not because he didn't trust James, but because he was waiting for him to understand something else. He was waiting for James to realize that their bond was more than just obedience. Max wasn't refusing because he was being stubborn. He wasn't refusing because he didn't love James. No, the refusal came from a place of deeper wisdom. He had always followed the commands, but now, it seemed, Max wanted something more. He wanted to be understood, not just commanded. And as James knelt there, looking into those amber eyes, it hit him. Max wasn't rejecting him. He was teaching him something. Something he had overlooked for so long. Something that would change everything between them. James sat on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest as he looked at Max, still standing at the far side of the room. The dog's eyes, once full of unquestioning trust, seemed to hold a quiet wisdom now. James had never seen Max like this before. The silence between them stretched out, thick and heavy, as if it carried more weight than either of them could fully comprehend. He had spent years trusting this dog, relying on him, following him into every situation, and now, here they were, stuck in a moment where neither of them knew how to move forward. Max had always been his rock. When James had been injured overseas, it was Max who stayed by his side, guarding him even when everyone else had left. When nightmares kept him awake, it was Max's steady breathing that would ground him, reminding him he wasn't alone. But now, Max stood there, unmoving, his refusal to follow the command hanging in the air like a cloud neither of them could shake. "Why won't you follow me, Max?" James whispered, his voice trembling just slightly. The dog didn't respond. He couldn't understand it. He knew Max. He knew that Max wouldn't hesitate unless something was deeply wrong. "Max, I need you." But even as he said the words, James realized something. This wasn't just about obedience anymore. This wasn't just about commands and following orders. Max was telling him something. Telling him, in the only way he knew how, that there was more to their bond than he had been able to see before. Slowly, James stood up, his legs feeling heavier than usual. He walked towards Max, who didn't move, still watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to say everything without a word. As James knelt down, He felt the old familiar weight of guilt rise in his chest. He had always relied on Max, trusted him blindly. But now, here was Max, refusing to follow, and James realized he had never truly stopped to understand the dog's silent language, the way Max communicated without words. "Max, what do you need from me?" James asked softly, his fingers brushing against the dog's head. Max didn't answer, but there was a softness in his eyes, a depth of understanding that James couldn't ignore. The truth hit him like a wave. Max wasn't rejecting him. Max was showing him something. He had always followed orders, but now, Max needed something more than just obedience. He needed a connection, a deeper understanding. For years, they had worked together, side by side, and yet James realized that in all their time together, he had never fully seen Max as more than a partner. He had never truly understood what it meant for Max to trust him, to follow him into danger, to stand by him in every battle. He had always thought of Max as his loyal companion, but now, Max was teaching him what true loyalty really meant. "You're more than just my dog, aren't you?" James whispered, a lump forming in his throat. Max's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, James understood. He understood that their bond went beyond the commands, beyond the work. It was a partnership, built on mutual respect, trust, and love. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Max was waiting for him to realize. Max wasn't refusing the command because he was being stubborn or rebellious. He was refusing it because he wanted James to see him as more than just a tool, more than just an obedient dog. He wanted to be seen as a partner, as an equal. And in that moment, James finally understood. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Max's, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur. "I'm sorry, buddy," he murmured. "I've always taken you for granted, haven't I?" Max nudged his head against James's cheek, a soft sound escaping him that almost seemed like a sigh of relief. It was as if the dog had been waiting for this moment, waiting for James to finally see him for who he truly was. A friend, a companion, an equal. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of their partnership shift. He had always been the one in charge, the one giving the orders. But now, Max had shown him that their bond was about so much more than that. It was about trust. It was about understanding. It was about a shared journey, one that couldn't be measured in commands or obedience. James stood up slowly, his hand resting gently on Max's head. "You're right," he whispered, smiling softly. "We're in this together, aren't we?" Max's tail wagged once, a quiet acceptance of the unspoken words between them. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. James sat in the quiet of his small living room, staring out the window at the crisp, clear sky. Max lay beside him, his head resting on James's boot, the dog's eyes half closed in contentment. It had been days since the incident, the moment that had shaken everything he thought he knew about their bond. But now, as he sat there, James realized that the distance between them had closed. They were no longer just a team of Marine and K9. They were something more, something that neither of them could have anticipated. The days that followed their confrontation had been a slow, silent healing. James found himself spending more time with Max, not just giving commands, but simply being present with him. They would go on long walks through the park, their steps in sync, the sounds of birds overhead, and the soft rustling of leaves filling the air. Each moment with Max felt like a quiet reassurance, as if the dog was reminding him of the simple things he had forgotten over the years. "We've got this, buddy," James would say as they walked, and Max, with his ever-present loyalty, would glance up at him with those amber eyes, as if saying, "I never doubted it." It wasn't just about the work anymore. It wasn't about the training or the missions. It was about the bond between them, a bond that had been tested and now felt stronger than ever. James had always believed in loyalty. He had always prided himself on being a reliable and steadfast Marine. But Max had shown him a deeper kind of loyalty, one that wasn't blind obedience, but one that was built on mutual understanding, respect, and the quiet moments they shared. The shift in their relationship didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a dramatic change. It was more like the slow dawning of a new understanding. They started to communicate without words, just a look, a gesture, a shift in posture. James would reach out and touch Max's head, and the dog would nuzzle into his hand, a silent acknowledgement that they were more than just a pair of partners. They were companions. They had been through too much together for it to be anything else. One evening, after a long day, James sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Max sat at his feet, watching the sun set in the distance. It was moments like these that reminded James why he had joined the Marines in the first place. It wasn't for the medals or the recognition, but for the camaraderie, the deep connections that formed in the most unlikely places. And now, he had that with Max. "You're my partner," James said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. Max's tail thumped gently on the ground, a sound of contentment. In that moment, James realized that everything he had gone through, the wars, the losses, the loneliness, it had all led him here, to this quiet moment with Max. He had never imagined that a bond with a dog could change his life in such a profound way, but it had. Max had taught him more about loyalty, love, and partnership than any human ever could. The past few days had been a lesson in humility. James had always thought of himself as the one who gave the orders, the one who led. But now he understood that leadership wasn't just about giving commands. It was about listening. It was about understanding when to push and when to pause, when to lead and when to follow. Max had shown him that true leadership came from respect, not control. And as the night sky darkened and the stars began to appear, James sat back, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Max, lying beside him, let out a contented sigh, his head resting on James's lap. There was no need for words. There was no need for commands. They were in this together, not just as Marine and K-9, but as friends, companions, partners in a journey that neither could have predicted but both would always cherish. James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the night wash over him. He didn't need anything else. He had Max, and that was enough. James woke up early the next morning, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains and casting a warm glow across the room. He glanced over at Max, who was still curled up in his usual spot by the door, the rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the quiet air. It had been a few weeks since that day, the day Max had refused the command, and everything between them had changed. James had noticed the difference, not just in how they worked together, but in how they were starting to understand each other on a deeper level. They were no longer just a Marine and his K-9 partner. They were something more. It was a bond built on trust, mutual respect, and the kind of understanding that transcended words. After all, Max had shown James what true loyalty meant. It wasn't about obedience alone. It was about connection. And now, as James looked at the dog, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. It was strange how something as simple as a refusal to obey a command could lead to such a profound shift. Max had always been his loyal companion, always ready to follow orders without hesitation. But now, Max had taught him something more. He had taught him that loyalty wasn't about blind obedience. It was about a relationship based on understanding and respect. James slowly stood up, stretching his arms over his head. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet and the soft thud of Max's tail wagging in his sleep. James smiled to himself. He walked over to the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee filling the air as he started the pot. As the coffee brewed, he thought back to their long walks together, the mornings when he would speak to Max without saying a word, and the evenings when they would sit side by side, watching the sunset in companionable silence. They didn't need to speak to communicate anymore. It was as if Max had unlocked something in him, a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly be connected to another living being. As the coffee finished brewing, James grabbed his cup and walked back into the living room. He sat down on the couch, taking a sip of the hot beverage as he glanced over at Max. The dog stirred, raising his head and looking at James with those familiar amber eyes, the look in them soft and trusting. James chuckled softly, reaching over to scratch Max behind the ears. "Good morning, buddy," he said, his voice low and warm. Max's tail wagged slowly, and he stood up, stretching before walking over to James's side. James smiled and patted the seat next to him, inviting Max to join him on the couch. The dog climbed up, settling beside him with a contented sigh. They sat together in silence for a while, each of them content in the other's company. As the day wore on, James couldn't help but think about the journey they had been on, both together and apart. He had spent so many years focusing on his duty, on the missions and the work that came with being a Marine. But in the process, He had forgotten what it meant to be truly present in the moment, to just be with someone, without the need for words or tasks. And Max had taught him that. The way the dog had refused to follow that command had forced James to step back and take a hard look at himself. It had shown him that there was more to their relationship than just following orders. It was about trust. It was about mutual respect. And it was about learning to listen. As they spent more time together, James began to see the world differently. He started to take those quiet moments, the ones where he and Max would simply be together, and he cherished them. He realized that those moments were just as important as anything else. In fact, they were the foundation of everything. James had always prided himself on being strong, on being able to handle anything that came his way. But Max had shown him a different kind of strength, the strength that comes from vulnerability, from being open and honest about what you need, and from allowing yourself to grow alongside someone else. And as he sat there with Max by his side, James realized that he had found something more valuable than any medal or honor he had ever received. He had found a true partner, not just in his work, but in his life. The bond they shared was one that could never be broken. It was built on the quiet moments, the understanding between them, and the unwavering loyalty that went beyond obedience. And as James looked at Max, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The past had shaped them, but it was the present that defined them. Together, they were stronger than ever. James stood at the edge of the park, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets as he watched Max. The dog was trotting around, sniffing the air, his usual energy and enthusiasm making the walk feel alive and effortless. It had become their routine. Early mornings, quiet walks, moments to reconnect, and just be. James hadn't realized how much he needed these moments until they became a part of his life, part of their new normal. As Max playfully ran after a stray ball that had rolled into the grass, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. There was something about the way Max moved, with a purpose but no rush. He was the perfect balance of focused and carefree, and James couldn't help but admire that. The mornings spent like this, in silence or occasional quiet conversation, had become his time to reflect. It wasn't just about the days before. Those memories, good and bad, were etched in his mind, but they didn't define him anymore. What defined him now was the way he lived in the moment with Max. He had always been a man of action, always thinking ahead, planning for what was next. But since Max had come into his life, since that day things had shifted between them, James found himself living in the present more than ever. He no longer felt the constant need to control every situation or to worry about what was coming next. Max had taught him that it was okay to slow down, to enjoy the moment for what it was. As they continued their walk, James's thoughts turned to the past few months. They had both been through a lot, in different ways. James had seen the darker side of life in the military, the uncertainty and the chaos. Max had seen his fair share of battle as well, but in the time they had spent together, James had learned that their bond had become something even more than he had ever imagined. Max wasn't just his partner in the field. He was his companion, his friend, and a source of unspoken understanding. The connection they shared was built on something deeper than just the need to perform tasks together. It was a bond of trust, something James had always found difficult to fully grasp with people. He had always been the one to lead, the one to protect, but with Max, there was no hierarchy. It was mutual, equal. And for the first time in his life, James understood what it truly meant to be a partner in every sense of the word. They had both changed. When Max had refused that command, it had forced James to see things differently. He had spent so much time focused on the idea that loyalty meant following orders without question, but Max had shown him that loyalty was about understanding, about knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. They were no longer just following each other's commands. They were learning from each other, growing together. The wind picked up slightly, and Max's fur fluttered as he paused and looked back at James, his amber eyes catching the light. James smiled and gave a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. "You ready to head back?" he asked, his voice soft. Max wagged his tail and trotted back toward him, as if answering without words. The bond between them had become something even stronger than before. It wasn't about obedience or commands, or even loyalty in the traditional sense. It was about a deeper connection that transcended everything they had been through. They were partners, equals, and it felt like everything was finally falling into place. As they walked back toward the house, James reflected on how much Max had changed his life. The dog had taught him patience, humility, and the importance of living in the moment. He had learned to appreciate the quiet moments they shared, the small acts of companionship that meant everything. He had learned to be present, and in doing so, he had found a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. Max had given him more than just his companionship. He had given him a new perspective on life, one where connection mattered more than anything else. James had always thought of himself as a solitary person, someone who could handle anything on his own. But Max had shown him that true strength came not from independence, but from the willingness to lean on others, to trust, and to allow yourself to be vulnerable. As they reached the door, Max looked up at him again, his eyes full of trust, and James knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side, just as they always had. James sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the trees. Max was lying next to him, his head resting on James's foot, as the two of them watched the world wind down for the day. The bond between them had only grown stronger in the months since that pivotal moment when Max had refused to follow an order. It was hard for James to pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed. Maybe it was the day they had walked together through the park, or perhaps it was when he realized that Max's refusal wasn't a sign of rebellion, but a reminder of their deeper connection. Whatever it was, it had shifted something in James. He no longer saw Max simply as a tool to be used for military work or as a companion to pass the time. He saw him as a partner. The change had been gradual, but it had been undeniable. Max had begun to act differently, too. He seemed more relaxed, less focused on the commands, but in a way that felt natural. His eyes, always sharp, now held a quiet wisdom, as if he understood something James hadn't yet fully grasped. For the first time in a long time, James realized that he was no longer just leading the way. He was walking alongside Max, listening to him, understanding him in a way he hadn't before. The simple act of being together, of sharing the moments of the day, had become just as important as anything else. It wasn't about the missions or the work anymore. It was about the bond they shared. And that bond, James realized, had always been there. He just hadn't seen it until Max had shown him what it truly meant. "You know, buddy," James said, his voice low and steady as he looked at Max, "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through." Max looked up at him, his amber eyes glinting in the fading sunlight. "I've always been so focused on what's next, on the missions, on the job, but I never took the time to appreciate what we have now." Max let out a soft sigh, his tail thumping against the wooden floor in response. It was as if he understood exactly what James was saying. They had always been a team, yes, but now, James saw them as partners in a way he never had before. They had been through so much together, through the challenges, the struggles, the victories, and the losses, and yet they had come out the other side stronger than ever. And now, as they sat together on that porch, James realized that he had everything he needed right here. He didn't need to keep looking ahead, trying to control every part of his life. He had Max, and that, he knew, was enough. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding that had developed between them over time. They didn't need to speak to communicate. It was in the way Max moved beside him, in the way he rested his head on James's foot, as if to remind him that he was there, always. James had spent so many years focusing on the next mission, the next challenge, never taking the time to simply be present. But with Max, it was different. They had found something special in the quiet moments, in the time they spent just being together. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the two of them, side by side, sharing the world as it unfolded around them. The world wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, always be obstacles to overcome. But James knew now that he didn't have to face them alone. Max would always be by his side, just as he had been before. The trust between them was unbreakable. James didn't need to ask Max to follow him anymore. Max was already there, already ready to walk beside him, no matter where the road led. As the night settled in, James stood up slowly, stretching his back. Max followed suit, getting to his feet and giving a small stretch of his own. They walked back inside together, side by side, as the quiet of the night wrapped around them. The bond they shared was unspoken, but it was stronger than any words could express. James knew that no matter what the future held, he and Max would face it together, as equals, as partners. They had already been through so much, and whatever came next, they would be ready. Because they were a team. A real team. The morning air was crisp as James stepped out onto the porch, Max following closely behind, his paws making soft padding sounds against the wooden floor. It was a familiar routine, one that had become a comfort over the past few months. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the trees in the distance. The world felt peaceful, still, as if the two of them were the only ones awake to witness the dawn. James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet embrace him. The chaos of the past, the noise and the uncertainty, seemed far away. In these moments, there was nothing but him and Max. As he looked down at the dog, who was now sitting calmly by his side, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had spent so many years caught up in the rush of life, always moving forward, always focused on what came next. But with Max, everything had changed. He had learned the importance of being present, of slowing down and appreciating the moments that made life worthwhile. Max had taught him that. The dog had shown him what it meant to live in the now, to cherish the quiet moments just as much as the loud ones. Max had become more than just a companion. He was a reminder to James of the beauty in simplicity, the power in just being together, without expectations or demands. As the two of them walked through the park, James couldn't help but smile at how far they had come. There was a time when he had been so focused on the mission, on the task at hand, that he hadn't noticed the subtle changes in his own life. But now, with Max by his side, everything had shifted. He had learned to take a step back, to breathe, and to appreciate the world around him. It wasn't just about what he did anymore. It was about how he did it. And Max had shown him how to do it with patience, understanding, and love. The trees around them were just beginning to bloom, the promise of spring hanging in the air. The weather was still cool, but the warmth of the sun's rays made everything feel alive, vibrant. James took in a deep breath, the smell of fresh grass and earth filling his senses. It felt good to be outside, to be present in this moment, with nothing but the sound of Max's footsteps and the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. Max stopped for a moment, sniffing the ground before looking up at James, his eyes full of the same quiet understanding that had grown between them. It wasn't just the dog's loyalty he had shown James. It was a bond that went beyond words, beyond actions. It was an understanding that needed no explanation. James knelt down and scratched Max behind the ears, a gesture that had become second nature to him. "You've changed me, buddy," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Max's tail wagged, and he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing as if to savor the moment. For a moment, James was lost in the simplicity of it all. It wasn't about what had happened in the past or what would happen in the future. It was about this moment. It was about Max and the quiet peace they shared together. As they continued their walk, James couldn't help but think about the lessons Max had taught him. He had always seen the dog as his partner, his loyal companion. But now, he realized, Max had been more than that. Max had been a teacher, a guide, a friend. The bond they shared wasn't just about working together. It was about understanding each other, about knowing when to lead and when to follow, about knowing that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. The world around them seemed to slow down, the weight of the past lifting with each step. The old wounds James had carried for so long felt less heavy now. He had found something deeper than he had ever expected, a friendship that was unconditional, a connection that went beyond duty. As they reached the end of the path, James stopped and looked around. The park was quiet now, with only a few early morning walkers in the distance. He turned to Max, who was sitting at his side, waiting patiently. "This is it, buddy," James said, his voice steady and sure. "This is what it's all about." Max looked up at him, as if understanding the weight of the moment. James smiled and reached down to pat him once more. "Thanks for everything." Max's tail wagged again, and they stood together for a moment longer, the sun now fully risen, bathing the world in its warmth. They didn't need words anymore. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them spoke louder than anything else ever could. Together, they had found peace. Together, they had found their place in the world. James and Max sat together in the quiet of the early evening, the sky painted with shades of orange and purple as the sun began to set. The sounds of the day were slowly fading, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It had been a long day, but one that had felt different, better somehow. There was a peace between them now, one that James couldn't explain but could feel in every quiet moment they shared. The journey they had been on, both together and apart, had brought them to this place, and James knew that he had found something that couldn't be taken away. Max shifted beside him, his large frame stretching as he stood, looking up at James with those familiar amber eyes. The dog was older now, but his spirit had never wavered. If anything, he seemed more content, more grounded, just like James. They had both grown, changed in ways they hadn't expected. And though the past was never far from their minds, it was the present they focused on now. "You've been my rock, buddy," James said, his voice soft but full of gratitude. Max turned his head, as if acknowledging the words, and nudged James's hand with his nose. James smiled, rubbing behind Max's ears. They didn't need words to communicate anymore. They never had. In the past few months, James had learned more than he ever thought possible. It wasn't just about commands, about following orders, or about loyalty in the traditional sense. It was about understanding, about knowing when to be still and when to move forward, about trusting each other without question. James had always prided himself on being independent, on handling everything himself. But Max had shown him the strength in leaning on others, in allowing himself to be vulnerable. It wasn't weakness, but the deepest form of trust, something that James had struggled with for so long. But now, as he sat next to Max, he realized that trust wasn't something to fear. It was a gift. The bond between them had evolved into something so much more than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about being a Marine and his K-9 partner anymore. It was about two souls that had found each other, two beings that had grown together through everything life had thrown at them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, James stood up, stretching his arms over his head. Max followed suit, shaking himself out before trotting over to James's side. "Come on, let's take one more walk," James said, his voice calm, steady. Max's tail wagged, and he looked up at James, his eyes filled with that silent understanding. Together, they walked, side by side, as they had done so many times before. The world around them was quiet, but it felt full. Every step they took felt like a step toward something bigger, something greater than either of them had known before. The trust they shared now was unspoken, but it was stronger than any bond they had ever had. They didn't need to prove anything to each other. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence together was enough. As they reached the end of the path, James paused, looking out at the horizon. The night was settling in, the stars just beginning to peek through the darkening sky. He could feel Max standing beside him, the warmth of the dog's presence a steady comfort. "We've made it, Max," James said quietly, almost to himself. "We've made it through everything." Max nudged his hand once more, the gesture small but full of meaning. James smiled, a small, contented smile. "Yeah, I know." The two of them stood there for a moment longer, watching the night settle around them, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had already been through so much, and together, they had found something that was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. It wasn't about what came next. It wasn't about the future or the past. It was about the present, about this moment, about being here together. James had learned that. Max had taught him that. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be at peace. The past would always be a part of him, a part of them both. But it was the present that defined them now. And as they turned to head back home, James knew that he wasn't alone. He had Max. And that was enough. James stood by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape that stretched before him. Max lay at his feet, his presence a comforting constant in the quiet night. The house was still, the world outside peaceful, but James's mind was far from calm. It had been months since that pivotal moment, the day when everything between him and Max had changed. And yet, despite all that had happened, despite the challenges and the lessons learned, there was still a sense of uncertainty lingering within him. He had always been a man who trusted his instincts, a man who had relied on his training and experience. But Max had taught him something that no lesson could have prepared him for. He had taught him the true meaning of partnership, of unconditional loyalty, and of the strength that came from vulnerability. As James looked down at Max, he couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had been so focused on his own struggles, his own demons, that he had failed to see what was right in front of him. Max had been there all along, not just as a dog, not just as a partner, but as a friend, a companion who understood him in ways no one else ever could. And now, James knew that he had found something far more valuable than any victory or accolade. He had found a bond that couldn't be broken. Max, in his quiet, steadfast way, had changed him. He had forced James to look beyond the surface, to confront his own limitations, and to learn that true strength wasn't about control or dominance. It was about trust, about knowing when to lead and when to follow, and about the quiet moments of connection that spoke louder than words. The room was silent except for the soft breathing of Max, the sound of his steady exhale a reminder that even in the stillness, they were together. James had learned that peace didn't come from action or achievement. It came from being present, from fully embracing the moment and everything it offered. And in that moment, as he stood there with Max at his side, he realized that this was enough. They didn't need anything else. The world outside might continue to change, but the bond between them would remain constant. The trust they shared was unspoken, but it was stronger than any words could express. James reached down and gently stroked Max's fur, the dog lifting his head and looking up at him with those amber eyes, as if to say, "We're in this together." It was the kind of quiet understanding that only time and experience could build. It wasn't about the past, it wasn't about the future, it was about right now. It was about the shared moments, the companionship, and the love that had grown between them over time. In that moment, James knew that no matter what came next, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he wasn't alone. Max had shown him that. They would face whatever came next, side by side, as equals, as partners. There was no greater strength than that. Max, the dog who had once followed orders without question, had shown him that loyalty wasn't about blind obedience. It was about mutual respect, about understanding each other without needing words. And as James stood there, with Max at his side, he knew that this was the most important lesson he would ever learn. Together, they were ready for whatever came next.